Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Today we're back with fiction author and former news reporter, Dani Safford. Hey, Dani, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me again.
Sure, it's a pleasure. Now, today I want to talk all about getting personal with fiction writing. So, Dani, how much of a main character's journey do you believe should be drawn from personal or observed experiences?
So, I believe that a main character's journey should have some personal components to it because I think that there's an advantage to writing what you know. Um, so, like my story, my novel is fiction, but the the stories within it or the storyline within it is a reflection of me, my personality, my struggles, my trauma. My main character's personality and her circumstances aren't exactly a carbon copy of my own, but the emotions, like the scars, the resilience, those are all real things that I felt, which gives me that advantage to be able to write them.
Now, how do you approach writing about heavy topics like emotional abuse?
So, writing about heavy topics like emotional abuse is kind of like a delicate balancing act. You know, you want to have like a raw and real story, but you don't want it to be so brutal that it becomes unreadable. So, you kind of have to touch upon those with kid gloves, I guess, is what you would say. But the goal isn't really to show pain in that sort of dialogue or narrative, it's to show survival and healing and all the kind of complicated, messy emotions in between. Um, it also, is important for just people to be able to relate to you, and maybe maybe someone's been through this experience, maybe someone is feeling that way, but at the end of the day, I don't want to write trauma for shock value. I write it specifically so someone who's been through that can see themselves on the page and think, oh, I'm not crazy. This I've been there too, and so someone else gets it.
Now, how much of the story do you embellish and how much do you keep 100% authentic to what you're actually basing your story from or the actual events?
I think that I draw inspiration from a lot of things that have happened in my own life, but that's the beauty of fiction. You know, it gives you that kind of creative license to make your characters go where you want them to go and do what you want them to do, even if that's not necessarily the way things happened or the way that you remembered them. If your source of inspiration is something that happened to you when you were 11 and it traumatize you forever. Maybe when you sit down and use that as sort of fodder to write your own story, maybe that thing happens differently in that dialogue, in that narrative.
Right. Now, I know that you were growing up in the 90s, so you do have that authentic personality and history. But for those authors, say, who want to set a book in the 1990s, but they did not necessarily grow up there or they don't know much about it, how do you ensure the authenticity of that setting?
So this is like actually a really interesting question. So I was a teenager in the 90s, but I still had to do my research because I was like, I this was my favorite song or this was my favorite show. And then I'm thinking, was that the 90s? Was that the 2000s? Like what, so obviously, we have the internet now. There are lots of resources available, but really the key component to writing something like that is not just what people had, but it's really how they lived. Um, the frustrations, the slow pace of information, the lack of social media, the not instant connection. Life was very different. So it's really those components that make the reader feel like you're in that time period rather than just indicating, what people wore or what song was popular at the time.
Right, right. And I want to transition a little bit now and talk about characters. So, how do you develop other complex characters and ensure they feel real and multidimensional?
So for me, I like to make sure that characters are not just like invented from scratch. It's really more about understanding them. Most of the characters that are in my novel are inspired by real people or they're carefully stitched together amalgamations of multiple people. And that's because I'm kind of an observer in general. I like to people watch. I've had just interpersonal relationships, obviously, my entire life. I'm about to be 40. So it was that time to where I was like reflecting back on the people I've known my entire life and things that I've been through. So I don't have to necessarily guess how a certain character would behave because I have kind of experienced that firsthand.
Right, right. I love the fact that you take traits from multiple people to build kind of the perfect character that you want. Now, what lessons have you learned from writing your novel that you would apply to future projects?
Oh, what lessons have I learned from writing my novel? Well, what lessons haven't I learned? It is kind of chaos. It's thrilling and it's terrifying. The first part was I had to get past that self doubt and that idea that I, it's a very overwhelming task when you first start to undertake this project. So I just started writing without having any real point or purpose to it, and then it sort of blossomed into what it became now. I would say that a big component would be not to rush the process. I sometimes will. It takes me a long time to get motivated to finish a task or just even start a task. So once I'm in that task, my brain tells me, "All right, well, you got to get this done. You have to get this done." And that was a huge thing for me that I had to step back and say, "Let's not rush this process. Let's take time to craft this. It's a marathon, not a sprint." So that's definitely a factor. Trusting the mess is also a huge factor because sometimes it's easier to just write and then go back later and say, don't let the imposter syndrome get to you. It happens to everyone, but give yourself that space, give yourself that time and that sort of grace that you need to get it done. And oh yeah, also, your characters will sometimes surprise you because I went in directions with them that I didn't anticipate. But it's just how the story unfolded, and I let it happen, and they kind of took on a life of their own, which was really great. And I'm glad that I didn't stick to this sort of rigid idea of how it was supposed to be, because what I ended up with was something that I'm much prouder of in the end.
Well, Dani, thank you so much. That was wonderful insight on getting personal with fiction writing.
Thank you so much.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's interview with fiction author and former news reporter Dani Safford. Be sure to check out our website for more videos. Wishing you all a fulfilling and successful writing journey.